Hello, very good evening, and a big welcome to everyone who's joined in. This is the last session of the day, and we're going to be discussing Project Pegasus, as my colleague told you. This is arguably the biggest story of the year, a landmark set of revelations spanning different countries, many news organizations, including our very own The Wire in India. The story briefly, these stories, in fact, briefly revealed how journalists, dissenters, and even politicians were potential targets of a spyware developed by Israeli surveillance company NSO. And for the first time, I think we were able to put a face to victims or potential victims of this massive global spy tech industrial mammoth complex. Thank you, Michael, Kabir, Sandrine, and Julien for joining us. And in the spirit of this excellent, wonderful collaborative project that you guys put together, I'd love for this panel to also be as collaborative. So please feel free to jump in with your comments, with whatever you want to say. Don't want to keep it very formal, keep it conversational. And I want to start with Sandrine. So, of course, all of us want to know how you got the story, but you can't tell us that because you need to protect your source. But why don't you take us through the initial days of when Forbidden Stories was first confronted with this massive data leak? I'm guessing lists full of numbers. How did you begin to even make sense of what was in front of you? So just take us through the initial days of discovering this big leak.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for that invitation. So Forbidden Stories is a non-profit Paris-based organization, and our first mission is to pursue the work of journalists who are silenced, either because they're threatened or arrested or killed. And so we've been working on threats against journalists for a while, and we discovered that many of the journalists we were interested in were basically targets of Pegasus. And that's how we started to understand that a cyber weapon like Pegasus was targeting journalists all across the world. And this is how we ended up with this huge leak, a massive leak of 50,000 phone numbers. This is all what we had, numbers all around the world, numbers we knew were potentially selected for targeting by clients of Pegasus. And we had more than 10 countries who were investigating. And so we started with the consortium of 16 media partners all around the world, including The Guardian, The Washington Post, Le Monde, The Wire in India, investigating that list and trying to put a face behind the numbers. So that was our first mission. And
how did you go about choosing your media partners? What was the criteria of collaborating with The Wire or say Le Monde, Guardian?
We're working in consortium for 4 years now. So we have partners we're working with for a very long time, like Le Monde or the Guardian. We immediately contacted them and share what we had. And then we, of course, also chose our partners according to the data we had. So we discovered that we had a lot of data in India and started investigating those data. We discovered the name of journalists, including journalists from The Wire. So we made sure to contact them in a safe way, to try to convince them to have their phone analyzed, to have the confirmation. And then we invited them to Paris as partners. So their position was, of course, different. They were at the same time targets and also partners, but they understood basically the stake of the investigation. So they were very careful in the way they were communicating with us, because this was really the biggest threat during the investigation. We didn't, of course, we knew that our phones were our worst enemies during that period. And so we basically had to investigate without our phones, which is a bit complicated, but we made it, and we made it in a complicated period because all the countries were still going through that COVID and Delta period, Delta COVID period. So yeah, we made it. We took a lot of precautions we even cannot speak of, but basically this has worked since everything was kept confidential until the day of publication, the 18th. And so on the 18th, all the partners, the 17 partners, published the same story at the same time. And this is also the why we're working as consortium. I mean, we need human resource to investigate such data. And we know that the impact is much higher when we are 17 publishing and not 1 or 2 media in the world.
Okay, it's very interesting. So you were already looking at journalists who were threatened across the world and who couldn't go about doing their work because of threats. And you saw that Pegasus was sort of a theme running through these threats, and that was your entry point into investigating it further, as I understand. Okay, and one thing interesting that Sandrine brought up was a lot of the journalists who were partners were also targets. So that brings me neatly to Kabir, because in one sense, you guys are also investigating or reporting on yourselves because you were also victims. Many of the, I think 4 journalists at least from The Wire were on the list, and 1 columnist, if I'm not wrong. So how does that work? Reporting, how do you maintain a sense of balance or a sense of a distance when you are part of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was difficult from the very beginning because we made a very clear distinction, and the story for us was always outside of the Wire newsroom. So because we were not looking at our reporters or our editors who've been targeted as the story. We were always looking for stories outside. So we knew we had the phones analyzed in the early period. So for us, like mentally, it was done and dusted. So the precautions that we needed to take, we needed to be very careful because it was entirely possible that some of those phones were still infected with Pegasus. So we had to be very, very careful of never having the phone in the room when we were having a conversation. So that is something that we did all the time.
And how many people in The Wire knew about the investigation? Like, was there how do you keep it a secret in such a small newsroom?
It was initially just 3 people who knew about it. Then we got more people on board, but in total we were a team of 6 who were investigating it by the end of it. And I mean, only 6 people who were working on it, because the risk, of course, was that it might leak. The more people we tell, the chances of information leaking out would increase. So we made sure that we had a small team, which also meant that there was a lot of work to be done by the 6 people who were working on it. But it never, I mean, The Wire is in the best of times a very small newsroom. And this was even smaller part of The Wire, which was investigating such a massive thing, which something like this, The Wire has also not worked on anything like this in the past. Most of us have never worked on anything like this in the past. So it was a new experience for all of us. But what helped immensely was just having the 17 media organizations and people who had worked and who've been veterans of doing these kind of investigations. So having access to them really, really helped a lot. So we never felt that we were on our own investigating something that we probably, like, individually we would not be able to. But since we had access to, and we could speak to everyone every day almost, and we had weekly meetings, India meetings they were called, and where we would see Michael, Julien, and the others who were reporting on India. And so that helped a lot in just keeping a sense of what is to be done, what are the steps to be followed, because it's investigations on screen look very glamorous, but they are not. In reality, when you're actually doing them, they are a set of repetitive steps that you have to take with different people. So just that, but we also got other people involved within The Wire who we did not tell the full story to. So we needed someone in Kashmir, for example, someone in Punjab. So we did get other people to do bits of reporting, but we would give them the minimal information that they needed to do that bit of reporting. So that is how we managed to put it all together by the end of it. We were, of course, like all of us, I think everyone here would agree that we were operating at a different pace to all of them, but we came together in the end. And there were some frustrations with that too in the beginning during the process, but it came together in the end, thankfully.
We want to know more about the frustrations, but I want to come to Julien.
Michael would be best placed to.
Michael, you're on mute. You'll have to unmute yourself and then express your frustration.
Michael did a fantastic podcast about how we worked all together. And actually, in your podcast, I remember you start the podcast by describing how those journalists came from all over the world to Paris, and Paris is quiet and empty because it's during the lockdown.
Yeah.
And we all met at Le Monde auditorium. I think there were like maybe 40 or 50 journalists. And I think that none of us would know exactly what it was about. It's just that, when we entered the auditorium and we had to leave the smartphones, I remember in a big black suitcase. So we had to enter the auditorium without smartphones to discuss the project. So it was quite interesting.
Sounds very exciting. But I think a lot of our viewers will also want to know, how did this collaboration occur? These multiple journalists from across the world. What was like your day-to-day communication like? What was the day-to-day procedures like? And how were you securing your information, like in terms of tech? Do you want to take that, Julien?
Yeah, for Le Monde, there was I think for all of us, there was a newspaper team and a country team. So, for example, at Le Monde, 5 journalists were covering the issue. So there were 2 journalists looking after the data privacy issues, and 3 other journalists covering different regions. So I was mostly, I was taking care of India. Somebody else was taking care of Middle East and Africa. So at Le Monde, we would meet once a week. And initially, it was just the 5 of us. There was no photo editor, graphic designer, no copy editor. So it was a very small meetings. And every week, we had also a meeting with the India team. So Michael, Kabir, and all of them.
And that would happen how? Like, what would you use to secure your communication?
In a secure way.
Okay, you're not.
This is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a bit frustrating, but of course we had to set up a very, very strict security protocol, because we knew we had a list every intel service in the world would want to have. We knew that we might be potentially targeted at any moment, and some of us were already targeted, their phone were compromised. So, this is such sensitive data. It's nothing we can say, and we'll never be able to say how we have been working during that time. But believe me, it's probably the most most secure protocol a consortium of journalists has set up for a collaborative investigation. Because we were not only investigating NSO, which has created the most invisible and invasive spyware in the world, we were also investigating governments that are not the most democratic or the nicest government in the world. We're speaking of governments who can kill journalists and cut them off in consulates. So we were extremely, all of us, and the 80 journalists were remarkably strict about using the protocol we had set up and never do otherwise.
Okay. I'm not getting much out of you in terms of details, but okay. Michael, do you want to elaborate on your frustrations, or should I just get to my question?
Absolutely no frustrations whatsoever. No. We would have weekly meetings as in terms of the Guardian team, and our investigations editor at one point was saying to me, we're not getting a lot out of India. Like when is that coming? I said to him, India is going to be the best story that comes out of this whole investigation. It's going to be the one that stands above all the others, but it's all going to happen in the last week. So you need to be prepared for that. But genuinely, The Wire did extraordinary work. The things that we were able to publish about what was happening in India, virtually unparalleled in any country. And that was 95% down to the kind of hard work and just the kind of clever way in which The Wire operated. So it was worth it in the end, definitely.
Great. Now, you've made a fantastic series of podcasts, which I highly recommend everyone should listen to if they haven't. I want to ask you, there's just so much information that you got through this leak, and there's just so much data. How did you make sense of it and pass through it to distill it into those 5 episodes? What was your methodology to do that? How did you?
Yeah. God, it was difficult because there's obviously so much to cover. But actually, like, it came very naturally, because I guess I thought, if I was to try to explain this story to somebody, what would you emphasize? And I think it was important for us to look. We knew ultimately we were talking to a British audience, and so that helped to guide us. But then also, we knew we couldn't be exhaustive. Like this is such a broad project. It ends up being dozens of stories. We cannot do that justice. So it was more about, like, how do we just tell a great story out of what we have? And to me, it was really important that each episode had like a different feel to it. So the first episode is like almost like a kind of spy film. It has that feeling of, Paris, and it's deserted, and it's a bit dystopic, and you're being led into an office and putting your phone in a suitcase, and then someone's opening up, a screen, and you're seeing numbers trickling down the page, and it tells itself. But then the second episode, we wanted to sort of tell the story of NSO and these attempts to try to track what they were doing. We were speaking to a guy from a group called Citizen Lab, and he was telling us about how he had an agent from an Israeli organization called Black Cube come to try to speak to him, to try to find out what he was looking into. And he was looking into NSO, among other things. He talked about how this guy was like clearly a fake agent, how he had a camera in his pen, and he was sort of awkwardly putting the camera in the face of this guy. And we just felt like that's really funny, right? So like that episode could be a little bit more lighthearted and funny. And then the episode in Mexico, if you listen, even the music has a kind of slightly like, Mexican guitar style feel.
Yeah.
We just we thought it was important that we can't just list things for people, right? But, we're talking about a story that spans the whole world. It has so many elements to it. So it was about trying to make every episode as diverse as possible. So just people kind of find every part of it interesting. Actually, it wasn't that hard, only because the story is just so good. Like we were working on something that was so interesting that our question was just how do we kind of do it justice, basically.
And how long did it take for you guys to produce the podcast?
A frighteningly small amount of time. It was far too little time, basically. We started working on it pretty much a week and a half before the July 18, the first story went up.
Okay.
Yeah. We did it in about how many days is that? Like 12 days or something. It was complete craziness. We just didn't I didn't sleep for days.
I thought you'd get like 6 months at The Guardian to do something like this.
No, my God, no, not at all. But I mean, look, I was working with a huge team. I mean, it was the first thing I did with our podcast team. And they are extraordinarily talented people. And they were the ones who did just so much of the work. So it was a kind of a team of about, on the podcast alone, a team of about 5 or 6 people, working basically non-stop in like a little room in The Guardian, where, like with everything else we did for this project, it had to be cut off from everyone else, phones outside, couldn't tell anyone else at The Guardian what we were doing. We had to kind of keep the door closed. We probably were spreading COVID back and forth for days and days. It was a complete, it was a very much a sort of tiny silo that we made. And we just worked really hard, but everyone was working really hard. I mean, Kabir, Sandrine, Julien, everyone, I think, was just working their butts off basically in those last few weeks.
Okay. Now, I wanna ask this question to each of you actually, so just, weigh in with whatever you think. With this story, the kind of secrecy you had to maintain with what exactly the list was. And, NSO then said that, okay, we've got nothing to do with this list. We don't even have such numbers. We don't even have access to our clients' data. They basically rubbished it. And there had to be essentially a secrecy maintained around your source, around where this list came from, what exactly it is. How tough was it? I guess not how tough was it, but Did you see this as a hindrance in building trust with your audience? Because you cannot come out clearly with what exactly you have or the methods through which you got it. Did you see this as hindrance in building trust with your reader, and how did you sort of surmount that? And because this is also something that your critics have used against you. I know that in India, at least, a lot of pro-government news channels have said that they don't know what they're talking about, possibly, maybe, using words like potential. So this is just something vague. Sandrine, do you want to take that? Did you see this as a challenge, and what did you think you could do to surmount it?
From the beginning, we knew
to these questions.
No, from the beginning, we knew that this would not be a data project. I mean, this was not the aim. Our aim was not to publish the list of people, but to do an investigative work. And all what we did, all the work we did before publishing our stories was basically about fact-checking, verifying the numbers. So this is why it took us a long time to try to get in touch with the targets we were seeing in our list, convince them to have their phone analyzed. And whenever we did that, the phone came back with traces of Pegasus when it was a phone used at the time of the targeting. So this made us very sure of what we were publishing. And we were, of course, cross-checking the data with every public information we had about Pegasus attacks, either citizen lab reports or WhatsApp leak, or the public targets of WhatsApp in India were all appearing in our list, for example. So there was no doubt, we had no doubt about what we were seeing, but this, of course, was not for us enough to publish. We published our stories with all the fact-checking, the evidence we had found all along the way. And today, you have the French government and authorities confirming that 5 ministers were basically targeted, and they found traces of Pegasus. Same thing in Belgium, where you have authorities confirming that the targets we have identified basically were Pegasus targets. So it's not only about our consortium publishing, it's all today about authorities confirming what we're finding. And I think in France, it's taken very, very seriously. We have meetings with authorities, off the record meetings, but they all tell us that what we found was big, quite serious. And we know that investigations are today going on in many parts of the world, and a lot is coming still on Pegasus.
Do you want to take that, Julien? Just your thoughts on how hard it was to sort of build a sort of...
So obviously, I mean, having a list is one thing, having numbers is one thing, but the other thing is to check the numbers. I mean, we did forensic, for example. So we did our work of journalists to check whether the information was accurate or not. No, the other difficulty was not only to check the information, it was also to find a story out of those numbers. So basically, you have a list of numbers. What do you do with it? First step is you have to find the people associated with those numbers. That's one thing. It's quite difficult because we had lots and lots of numbers in those lists. And in that regard, it was super useful to work with the Wire journalists because they had lots of contacts in India. Mm-hmm. That was one thing. The other thing was to find a story. So why those people were possibly targeted at that period of time. And so for that, there are different possibilities. So we had to see at that period of time what happened and why those people were targeted. And sometimes the people were not that famous. So it took a lot of time also to make sense out of this data. And that's what it was interesting. The other difficulty also is that you can't call the people and say you've been infected with Pegasus because we had to keep it secret till the date of publication. So
that must have created a lot of problems because a lot of people probably were just not sure of what you were asking them or what you wanted because you had to maintain so much.
So I think I mean, Michael, the Wire journalist, they found a magic formula, to speak to people without.
There was no formula. So many people yelled at us. So many people yelled at us.
Yeah.
Yeah, like one of our reporters was actually told that, "Do you want money?" Like he went to somebody to tell him that your phone is possibly hacked. He said, "Do you want money?" Like, but so many people would yell at us because we would call them, give them the least amount, very little information. We cannot tell them anything over the phone. So we would just ask them to just join us on a secure link, and then we will be able to tell you. So a lot of people would not be convinced. Like, especially if they don't know you, they would not be convinced, and they would just yell at us. Sometimes they would say no. A lot of times they would say no, so it would take a lot of calls to just convince them. We cannot tell them a lot over email, over WhatsApp, over anything to do with the phone. So we have to, we cannot tell them that your phone is possibly hacked via email, via WhatsApp. So there was that difficulty in just getting them onto that secure link where we could tell them. The next step would be to convince them to do forensic analysis, which was the most
very
critical.
hard.
Yeah, which is, and also, that forensic
because not everyone wants to give their phone,
exactly.
up for an examination.
They're not sure what amount of data, what the pictures, their messages, so they're not sure about that. And forensic analysis was the most critical part of our investigation, because that is what would give us the evidence, the proof that this data is real and this person was actually hacked, which is a lot better than saying that person was potentially hacked. So that is what we needed for our investigation. So we needed to convince a sizable number of people to do those forensic analysis, and for us that was what was really, really tricky. And we till now we've not been able to convince a lot of people to do that. Although we did manage to convince a lot of people, and we did turn out positive infections for a lot of people. But that process was complex, and even the process of just doing the forensic analysis of uploading the backup of your phone also took a while, and not everybody in our office associated with the project was particularly tech savvy, or the person who's uploading the backup was not particularly tech savvy. So that was also a problem sometimes for us as well. So it was a steep learning curve as well, because we had to learn how to do this very quickly. Because with many of these people, we would only get one opportunity. If we mess up in that one opportunity, if somehow the backup doesn't go, they might not agree to give us the phone again. So that happened a lot. And we still continue to do forensic analysis of people's phones even now. A lot of people are now coming forward as well to, they're more, they're still cautious, but there is a sense of, they still fear that the data might, someone else might have access to their data, but it's better than it was at that time, because at that time people had very little idea of what this is about.
Michael, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think Kabir's absolutely right. It's an exceptionally difficult thing to be called by a journalist who you don't know, who you don't really trust, who says to you, I have information that your phone might be. Well, you don't even hear that, right? You're told, I have information to share with you about cybersecurity or something. And then I need to persuade you to get onto a kind of more secure channel so I can give you a bit more information. We had to kind of be very creative with the truth. I remember there was one person, I have to be careful how I say it, but I remember there was one person I spoke with, and I said, I'm Michael, I'm a journalist with The Guardian, and somebody is going to contact you in person in the next couple of weeks, and they're going to claim that they've been sent by me, and they're going to tell you something that is going to seem unbelievable, but I just want to tell you that it's true. And I can't tell you what it is or when they're going to get in touch, but just remember that it is yes. I did ask them to speak to you, basically.
I don't know what I'd do if I got that call.
It's a weird call, but what I found more often than not is the response you get is a very solemn one, because people understand that you don't muck around with this stuff. You don't call them and drop something like that on them unless you're serious. And so the people, I mean, many of the people that I spoke to in this way, they just got it. They got that this is something worth taking seriously. And then on the other hand, as we got closer to publication and when we were finally informing people about the fact that they were going to be mentioned in our stories as potential hacking victims, there was the most wonderful feeling of liberation when you could just get on the phone to someone and say, "We think you've been hacked using Pegasus." And it was fantastic. They were the conversations I really enjoyed because you just felt so free. I remember in the case of Imran Khan, exactly, getting the phone number of the information minister in Pakistan and just being able to tell him, like reading a number out and saying, "This number I've just read you is Imran Khan's number. And I know this because it's on a list. And this list is people who, we think may have been hacked using Pegasus." And it was just fantastic because you get to kind of finally, this stuff you've been holding in for months and not telling anybody, you finally get to shout it from the rooftops. It was great.
So you guys have touched on how hard it was to convince people. Go ahead.
Yeah, I must say that people, all the people didn't have necessarily a positive attitude. Like I remember I talked to a few people and they were like a bit shocked, and immediately they said, "But I didn't do anything wrong," They felt a bit guilty most of the time because they worked with organizations also, so they were wary of the consequences. They were trying to understand what wrong did they do. So it was not necessarily a good news for those people. I mean, my problem was that, for example, I was working on the Rafale issues. So there were lots of defense companies. And obviously it's very difficult to convince those people to give a smartphone. But for other people, they were a bit scared and wary also.
What was difficult as well when we had to announce basically to some of the people that their phone was probably hacked or at least targeted, was the sense of guilt they had in some cases. I remember Khadija Ismailova, who is a famous investigative journalist in Azerbaijan, who has been arrested, harassed. We waited for her to be in Germany to tell her that her phone was in the list and to have her phone analyzed. We discovered her phone was compromised. But the first thing she felt was guilt because she remembered all the people she contacted through Signal, thinking that Signal was an encrypted and secure way of communication. And she felt, well, my God, I put those people in danger. And it was very hard at some point calling all these people, seeing the guilt they had. Some of them were journalists who might have put their sources in danger. Others were activists in countries where people are arrested, where people are threatened. So this was at some point very difficult also for us, even, humanly speaking.
Actually, for you, it must be all the more difficult in the beginning, right, Sandrine? Because you guys made the initial contact with journalists to without, you weren't able to tell them what exactly the story was, but you had to convince them to get them on board. How did you gain the trust of your, media partners? I know there is a consortium and you work with them, but still, and did you get pushback from journalists like that you were working with? Did you have a lot of questioning from them? Because, these are also editorial minds, like, so many editorial minds together, probably pushing back on, no, we don't think this works, or we need more information on stuff. How was that experience like in the beginning?
Before you decide on a topic like this, before you decide to contact a partner for collaboration like The Wire or Direct 36, you already know somebody who know that partner, who has been working with that partner. So basically, we didn't contact The Wire or Siddharth, or we didn't contact Direct 36 out of nowhere. We worked on, we did our homework, like trying to find out who was the best contact, how we could contact them safely. Often we were going through one journalist we already knew to contact that journalist. We usually send people on the ground because we couldn't do that even on a secure line. For us, it was too risky at the beginning. We really didn't know what we were dealing with. So we found somebody who went to see Siddharth from The Wire at the beginning, who convinced him to put his phone in a different room. That person had bought a specific device for us to communicate with Siddharth, and so this is how we did, and so it took a very long time. But at some point, once people see how serious this is, and those people are all investigative journalists. They understand the stakes very quickly. They were immediately on board, and they immediately accepted the rules we had to set up.
Okay, I have to take questions now in a bit, but I have two quick questions that I want all of you to dwell on. Guys who are watching, please put your questions at themediarumble.com/live in the comments section. We're going to be picking up questions from there, so do that, and we'll take them in the next 5 minutes. We have two not-for-profit here, Forbidden Stories and The Wire, and two people from big legacy media organizations, Monde and Guardian. So I just want to ask, let's start with the legacy guys. When you're working on an investigative story, what are the problems of working in a big legacy media organization? I mean, do you feel like there's some aspects maybe would have been easier had you been working with a not-for-profit? What are the pulls and pressures of working with a legacy media, not just for Pegasus, but for investigative stories?
Julien, do you want to take that?
Yes. Well, it's true that we're not a non-profit organization, but it doesn't mean that we make a lot of profits.
Yeah, we're involuntarily not for profit, I think.
Yes, exactly. So I'm not sure the
but it's not just about profit or not for profit, but being in a big organization
to do profits. No, so the importance, I guess, for Le Monde is not to lose money. That's for sure, but. The shareholders of Le Monde, they know that Le Monde will never be very profitable. No, but so I didn't feel any pressure. You know, at one point, so for example, 10 years ago, Le Monde's revenues were coming from advertising. It was like 50% advertising, 50% subscribers. Now, I think it's 80 or 90% of the Le Monde revenues that come from subscribers.
That's
so
excellent.
We can do any investigation we want. If the readers of Le Monde like it, let's go for it. I'll give you an example. 3 months ago, I did a story on the Total company in Burma. And so the Total CEO was very angry, and he canceled advertising campaign with Le Monde. So we lost a lot of money. But, you know, the director told me, well, at the end of the day, it's good because we got more readers thanks to your stories. So it's pretty good, and so I don't think Le Monde gives in, you know, any pressure. It doesn't exist as such. Now, you know, of course, we have to write stories. It's difficult to spend a year on an investigation story without writing anything else. Yes, that's for sure. But you know, so me, for example, on the Pegasus story. For 3 months, you know, I could be dedicated on that story and only on that story for 3 months, and it's a luxury. I'm aware of that.
Great, and I think it's a very important message for all our viewers. You have to subscribe. You have to pay for news if you want news to serve public interest. So do that. Subscribe to the organizations that you think are doing good work. It's very important to support good journalism, and that's what will keep it going, not advertisers. Michael, you want to come in? And I don't mean this in a sense of just, you know, corporate pressure or...
No, I understand. You're talking organizationally,
Yeah, maybe even organizationally.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would say it's sort of, you're definitely less nimble in a bigger organization. You know, you kind of, obviously there's more bureaucracy, there's more people's approval you need to seek. But I think The Guardian understood that this sort of project was very much core to our mission and was a big deal. I mean, you know, it was very much in the tradition of the WikiLeaks disclosures, the Snowden revelations in 2013. And I think with something of kind of this nature, the organization really can kind of pull in one direction. And normally the Guardian is huge, and it's so many people doing so many different things. But especially in the weeks leading up to the publication, we would have big all of Guardian meetings. You might have 24 people on these calls from all the different departments. And to see a big, talented, powerful organization all pulling in one direction towards getting one story, podcasts, visuals, sub-editors, legal, everything, every part of the company, was a beautiful thing to watch. Like it was something that I really enjoyed, because I felt like, when, you've got normally sort of 2 or 3 dozen spotlights, and when they're all pointing in one direction, it's very, very powerful. And it was, normally the disadvantages of being in a big organization really were swept away for something like this, because people get it. I mean, like, what is the Guardian for if not for stories like this? I think people get that.
We, as working for the Wire in a smaller organization, not for profit, what is the flip side of what were the issues, and what is something you felt that, okay, if I was in a bigger organization, I could have done this better? What are the challenges for doing something like this, an investigative project for a not-for-profit, relatively smaller organization?
Initially, like, I personally had doubts if we would be able to do it, if we had the capacity to do it. But we did eventually, because there was hunger as well, because almost none of us had done anything of this size before and scope. So there was hunger, so everybody worked harder than they usually do. And everything came together in the sense of, so our focus from the very beginning, as our editor made clear to us, was that we have to identify as many people in this list as possible. So that was our focus from the beginning. So we had to compromise on certain other things. So we were focused on identifying something, which is why we've been able to identify more than 300 people in the list. And that identification also involved several processes. So it wasn't easy. Like, one layer of identification would be that you have someone's name show up on a Truecaller or Call app. But that's not enough. You need another source of confirmation for that. So we focused our energies on that, which is why we were able to get so many stories as we did. I don't even know how many now. But the flip side to that was that we were not able to focus on one story, that we were not able to dig deep into one story and tell the entirety. So there would be certain aspects. So those stories are still for the taking. Like, they're there to be followed up. That what actually happened, what happened behind the scenes. There is a lot to be done there, which we can do in the time to come, or other media houses can do. So that is something that I felt, and I'm not even sure how if that would have been different had it been a legacy or a bigger media organization or a bigger team working on this, because the time we had was very short. So we had almost like 2 or 3 months. That's it. So I'm not sure how much difference it would have made. I guess we'll only find out as we do more investigations which involve different sizes and scopes. So I'm not sure, but I think that the Wire, given its capacity, did an extraordinary job of investigating these stories.
Sandrine, do you want to come in quickly on Forbidden Stories being a not-for-profit? And I think with you've experienced both sides. You've also worked with legacy media organizations, investigating, doing some landmark investigations for them. Pros and cons of working with legacy while investigating and working with a smaller sort of a not-for-profit organization like Forbidden Stories.
I mean, we don't choose our partners according to those criteria. Basically, we choose partners who want to work with us. We choose partners who are good investigative journalists who believe in what we do, and at the start of our mission is the will to pursue the work of assassinated journalists, and this is how we create our first partnership. So then, being a non-profit, being a bigger news legacy, I mean, I think we also have a relation with journalists personally. We have working relation. We know each other. We rely on people who know, good journalists. Who know each other. So this is not. I think Michael or Julien or Kabir would have done the same work wherever.
But personally, for you as an investigative journalist, do you have a preference because you've worked with both big media and with legacy? With legacy and with not-for-profit. As an investigative journalist yourself, what do you perceive are the pros and cons of the two different?
I mean, we have the time at Forbidden Stories to do one big investigative a year, which is really something that is not given to many journalists, investigative journalists.
Wow.
And this is something we really appreciate. This is why we come with those big projects, because basically we don't have to publish a story every day, every week, every 2 weeks. And time is really our most precious friend, because this makes the difference between a journalist and an investigative journalist. Basically, it's time. But I'm sure the Guardian give a lot of resources, Le Monde as well, a lot of resources, a lot of time in those stories, because we know how impactful they are. And in that specific case, there was not any difference between the partners. Everybody understood basically the impact we're going to have.
So Forbidden Stories publishes one story a year. I mean, one big project.
One big project, because our work is really to initiate projects, to lead them and to coordinate them. But then we are a small team here in Paris. We, of course, wouldn't be able to have the same resources than other media like Le Monde, The Guardian, and we believe in collaboration. We believe that collaboration brings protection to journalists. We believe that everybody's it's a win-win relationship. What The Wire does helps everybody here in Paris, in London. What Michael did helped a lot of people all over the world. So it's a win-win game.
Just wanted to quickly also add that Forbidden Stories was actually the smallest team in this. So I think they're a team of about 12 or 14 people. And the way they managed to, because their job was just also to report and to coordinate.
And lead the investigation really.
Exactly. So, and so many hundreds of 80 uncontainable journalists, which was a commendable. So in a sense that this project was also proven that, and also that none of the teams had even the legacy media had huge teams working on this. So pretty much the size across organizations, number of people working on this project was about the same. So in a sense, this project's also proven that maybe size does not matter. The number of people working, so it's possible. I don't know.
Great. Okay, so I'm quickly going to take questions. I have time for 2 questions. This one is from Siraj, who says governments, especially the one in India, defends the use of Pegasus by giving the national security argument. How can that argument be countered? At any time government wants to suppress any right, the reasonable restriction phrase is used by governments, given that we can't access the list of people that were compromised. So how do you counter this? We're doing this for national security argument. Anyone can take that.
Yeah, if you simply look at the people who we know were hacked, then the national security argument collapses immediately, because you're talking about journalists, you're talking about lawyers, activists. I mean, it's such an absurd argument that's used only for national security, because we can see on the face of it that it's not. The other point to make, which I think is really, really important, is that this tool is meant to be used for national security purposes. And yet me and Julien and Kabir and Sandrine, we all managed to get our hands on this list. We were scrolling through a list of potentially what contained some of India's most sensitive intelligence secrets, like the people who.
Well, we've lost you now. Okay. We've lost you completely. Kabir, I'm just going to go to the next question because we're also running out of time, and then maybe Michael can join us
just on the, just on that point, just a very simple answer. But how do you know that how do you make sure that the government follows the rules and doesn't spy on everyone? I mean, for that there should be rules and there should be an independent body, maybe who overlooks what the government does. I mean, government says something, but why would you trust the government? I mean, we had a list where hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't face any criminal charges were potential targets. So which means that maybe we should not trust entirely the government. And the use of Pegasus should be, at least should be, there should be guidelines and very precise guidelines. It should not be the jungle because, our privacy is at stake. So I think it's a very important issue.
And I think like Michael pointed out that many of those people, there was just no reason to be targeting them because they didn't pose any national security threat. In India, you had students, you had protesters, you had journalists. Kabir, last question for you.
And we don't know how the government is using those information. We don't know where those information go actually. Is it someone sitting at the PMO office, at the Prime Minister office? Is it an agency? Is it the Home Ministry? Is it the NSA? I mean, who is using those information and for which purpose? I think they are legitimate questions.
Manisha, could I make one point now that my internet appears to be working again?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's just this. It's that the very fact of this investigation was that, at some point in time, all of us, all the journalists who are on this list, were sitting in front of a list of possible surveillance targets of the Indian government. Now, if a government was serious about national security, would
Oh, he was just about to make an important point. But okay, we'll wait for him to come back. I'm really running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly go to Kabir. I hope Michael can just get his internet fixed and just make his point quickly. Kabir, why has there been a lukewarm response to this story among the Indian public? Is it because of COVID second wave, or are we just lax when it comes to the concept of privacy?
Yeah, I think the second wave was over by then. I think it goes back to the point that you were making earlier, that the mainstream media's focus was to discredit the story. And it's still the mainstream media which most people access. So the newspapers, the mainstream newspapers and the news channels, their focus was to discredit the story and not to follow up on the story. So like I also mentioned that all the stories that we did also need follow-ups, but those follow-ups have not happened. And in a thriving media environment, you would expect that other media would pick up those stories and do those and follow those stories. Instead, in India, the focus has been on discrediting, saying that the list is not real, etc. So, and that's what most of the people follow. So I think that's the main reason why that has happened. And also, I guess, again, like we were discussing earlier, that privacy concerns in India are different than they are in the West. So in India, we are used to our aunties and uncles peeping into our lives. So maybe privacy is not really a big issue either. Like our phones are being looked into by the government. Many people would expect that as well. But I guess those are the two reasons. But mainly it's the mainstream media. I'm sure that if the mainstream media had done its job, then the reaction would have been very, very different. And the story would have, the story is already huge. Just by its very nature, even in this very concocted, very strange media environment that we have in India, the story is still very, very huge. But it would have had a life of its own had the mainstream media done its job.
I think that's a very important point. Julien, do you just want to come in with how the story is being received in France, and since you've also worked in India, just a comparison of the two countries? How you think the story played out in France and in India?
So I think that the impact was maybe bigger in India than in France. For at least one reason is that in India the political parties, the opposition, took up the issue. That issue was taken up in the parliament also. So in France, the problem is that there was absolutely no accountability from the part of the government. So basically, for example, Macron, who is a potential target of Pegasus because his name was on the list, we still don't know now if his mobile was infected or not. And we just learned yesterday from a leaked report that 5 ministers had, I mean, they were like, they found traces of Pegasus on their phones. So yeah, the problem is that the French government did not communicate on it at all. They didn't speak on it. The only thing that the French government did was to set up a defense council. We asked many questions to the French government and they did not respond. But so I think there was more of an impact in India than in France. And you know, Kabir, when you said that, you know, people in India are used to the fact that maybe their phones are being tapped or, you know, there's more surveillance in India. I think Pegasus also is totally different because you have access to the location of the person, you have access to the contact list, photos and videos. So it's much more than tapping your phone, Pegasus.
Yeah. But it takes a while to understand. It takes a while for people to understand that. I mean, just the extent of what Pegasus can do more with your phone than you can. But it takes a while for people to understand that. And I mean, for many people who I called, they told me that you're telling me now I have known since 2001 or 1999.
Yes.
That I have been listening to.
So maybe people also, because I was trying to understand, and maybe people internalize the fact that maybe now there is no privacy and they got used to it. And maybe that's why they were not shocked to learn about Pegasus.
Great. I'll have to wrap this up now. We've already overshot our time. Unfortunately, we lost Michael's audio and video.
I'm still here.
Okay. You want to quickly make that point and then I have to wrap it up.
You know what? I feel like I built it up now. I don't know. It wasn't even that good a point. No, I was just going to say that, you know, it's the guardians of national security who tell us that the use of Pegasus is legitimate. But for me, the really important point here is that people like Julien, like Kabir, like me, like Sandrine, we were literally scrolling through a list of potential Indian surveillance targets. This is some of the most sensitive information that the Indian government has, and journalists like us got to look at it. And my argument is, if you're serious about national security, why would you outsource something as sensitive as your intelligence capacity to a private company when the risk is it can be exposed to the world? And in my view, a government that is serious about national security, that wants to lecture us about national security, would not be seeking these kinds of shortcuts that result in India's surveillance targets being splashed on the front pages of newspapers across the world.
Fair point.
And the last thing I wanted to add is, you know, talking about the differences between France and India. In the Pegasus story, India is a unique case in the sense that that's the only democracy which used Pegasus. I mean, the only so-called democracy that used Pegasus and was victim of Pegasus. Because France, as far as we know, didn't use Pegasus, but was victim of Pegasus. So India.
Wow, now we're losing. This is just.
Misha, can I say, when you want to get a sense of how hard it was to do this investigation, think about how hard it is to make this 1 hour call work. And then somehow we managed to communicate with each other for months.
Absolutely. On that note, thank you so much, guys, for joining us. This is really fabulous. I wish we could, so many things that I'd like to touch on, but we're out of time. Thanks a lot. And because this is a Zoom thing, we had a lot of issues, but hopefully next year we could do this in person. And we could have you all guys here in New Delhi and talk about more interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, people who've been with us.